everybody, I'm Ryan, and over the course of the past few weeks, we've talked a bunch about blue-white control in Standard. We've talked about the deck overall, how to play the deck, card choices in the deck. We've talked about how to sideboard with the deck against the top 10 most popular decks in Standard. We've talked about different flex slots and builds that you can have with the blue-white control deck, and I've talked about some tips and tricks with it. So I wanted to combine all of those videos into one giant deep dive. Enjoy. So this is blue-white control. As far as the lands go, we have some pretty exciting stuff going on. First off is Blast Zone. It is a colorless land that comes in untapped. XX and tap it to put X charge counters on Blast Zone, and it enters with a charge counter as well. And you can pay 3 mana and tap it and sacrifice it to destroy each non-land permanent with mana value equal to the number of charge counters on Blast Zone. So it's a land, produces mana, and it is a removal as well. Playing a single Demolition Field, which is a colorless untapped land as well. We can pay 2 mana and tap it to sacrifice it, destroy target non-basic land an opponent controls. That land's controller may search a library for a basic land and put it on the battlefield. Then shuffle. You may search a library for a basic land, put a card, put it on the battlefield, then shuffle. So great hate against other good lands, like Fountain Port. Fountain Port is, again, a colorless untapped land. You can pay 2 mana, sacrifice a token to draw a card. We can pay 3 mana to pay 1 life, create a 1/1 blue fresh creature token. And you can pay 4 mana and tap it to create a treasure token. So it combos with itself, but also there's some other tokens in this deck. And so it's a great mana dump. It can provide a little bit of a threat. It can provide a mana advantage, and it can provide massive card advantage in a land. Fountain Port is absolutely excellent. Restless Anchorage is our man land. Enters tapped. It produces our colors. And we pay 3 mana until end of turn. Restless Anchorage becomes a 2/3 white and blue bird creature with flying. It's still a land. When it attacks, create a map token, which you can then sacrifice Fountain Port, which is pretty awesome. The overall strategy of this deck as a whole is to stop what your opponent's doing and then provide either a large threat or control everything as you slowly whittle down their life total with the fish, or, you know, with Beza or the Overlords, stuff like that. Which means this deck is kind of divided into 3 categories. It's card advantage, it's control, and then it's like threats. So to kind of talk about a bunch of the control cards, Get Lost is our big premium removal. It's a 2 mana instant, destroy target creature, enchantment, or planeswalker's controller creates 2 map tokens. So it's a little bit of a downside, but it's reasonably unconditional, which is really nice. We're playing Change the Equation as a counter spell, 2 mana instant. Counter target spell of mana value 2 or less, or counter target red or green spell of mana value 6 or less. Standard's pretty low to the ground right now, and so Change the Equation is pretty good against most decks and has targets against every deck. Playing 2 Negate, counter target non-creature spell for 2 mana. Non-creature spell is very, very powerful right now. It's important that you win the super long games that with the decks that are really good at grinding. And No More Lies is 2 mana instant, counter target spell unless controller pays 3. It's a mana leak effect. If that spell is countered this way, exile it instead of putting it into its owner's graveyard. So that's our counterspell suite and our instant speed removal suite. As far as some board wipes, we have Temporary Lockdown. Temporary Lockdown is the 3 mana enchantment. When it enters, exile each non-land permanent with mana value 2 or less until Temporary Lockdown leaves the battlefield. Very good against the super aggressive decks, and pretty good against the self-bound decks as well. Stock Up is our primary card advantage. It isn't our only card advantage, but it's our primary one. It's a 3 mana sorcery. Look at the top 5 cards of your library, put 2 of them into your hand, and the rest of the bottom of your library in any order. 3 mana and it being a sorcery is kind of big, but having crazy card selection and 1 card replacing itself with 2 cards is literal advantage, and we get to select what cards we want. Stock Up is probably the best card advantage engine in Standard at the moment. We're also playing 3 Beza in the main deck and 1 in the board. Beza is an incredibly good controlling and mid-range card. It's a 4 mana 4/5. When it enters, create a treasure token. If an opponent controls more lands than you, gain 4 life if an opponent has more life than you. Create 2 1/1 blue fresh creature tokens if opponent controls more creatures than you. Draw a card if opponent has more cards in hand than you. So it's a great catch-up card. It's a great card that can stabilize the board kind of by itself, gain you a little bit of life, give you a little bit more time in life and blockers, draw some cards, whatever. And that's kind of the name of the game. We're playing 3 Day of Judgment, 4 mana, destroy all creatures. This has additional board wipes. And we're playing 4 Jace Perfected Mind. This is another one of our card advantage engines, and it's a win condition as well. Actually, it fills both of those roles. It's a 4 mana planeswalker with 1 of the blue mana being Phyrexian mana, which means you can pay 2 life instead of that mana, and it'll enter with 2 less loyalty. We get +1 until your next turn. Up to 1 target creature gets -3/-0. Pretty good if your opponent has only 1 threat. It's a -2 as target player mills 3 cards. Then if a graveyard has 20 or more cards in it, you draw 3 cards. Otherwise, you draw a card. So that's the card advantage here, and crazy card advantage as the game goes really long, which happens all the time. And it's -X as target player mills 3 times X cards, which very often after you've controlled the board, maybe they're answering your threats and stuff like that, you can just go 4 mana, mill 15 cards, and sometimes that can win you the game, especially after if you've gone through a Jace or 2 before and milled 3 cards here or there and had like a super long game. Sunfall is our last board wipe. It's 5 mana, not 4 mana. However, we exile all the creatures and we incubate X, so it can create a threat in and of itself, but 5 mana and 4 mana, that's a large jump. We're playing 4 Ride's End, which is a 5 mana instant that exile target creature or vehicle. However, it costs 3 less to cast if it targets a tap permanent. Very good against the aggressive decks, especially since exile removal is so important. Playing a single Horn-Locked Whale, which is on the adventure side, a 2 mana instant. Lagoon Breach. The owner of target attacking creature you don't control puts it on their choice of top or bottom of their library. So decent way to have temporary removal and then also buy you some time. And it is a 6 mana Flash War 2. Hornlock Whale enters tapped unless it's your turn. Pretty decent threat and pseudo removal in 1 card, and both are at instant speed, which we love. And then we're playing 2 Overlord of the Mistmoors. Overlord of the Mistmoors is a 7 mana Avatar. When it enters or attacks, create 2 2/1 white insect creature tokens with flying, and we can impend it for 4 mana. This is one of our major threats, the way we end the game. Very good against these mid-range decks and actually self-bounce decks as well. After we've stabilized, or if we need blockers, we just play Overlord of the Mistmoors and we can just win. As far as the sideboard goes, Devout Decree. It's a 2 mana sorcery, exile target creature or planeswalker that's black or red. Scry 1, decent against like the pixie decks, really good against the red decks. You know, like we kind of love this card. I love that it hits Kaido, which is really nice, and Scrying, so we can get some card selection is also important. Playing 2 Rest in Peace for that graveyard hate. We've already talked about Beza and Overlord and Negate, so we're kind of just like finishing out play sets and adding additional cards to their sideboard. What's cool is we have this card selection with stock up, so like that main deck kind of splitting up a bunch of cards that might be sideboard cards is actually totally fine. We're playing 3 Tishana's Tidebinder for those enter the battlefield effects, so 3 mana 2/3 with flash. When Tishana's Tidebinder enters, counter up to 1 target activated or triggered ability. If an ability of an artifact, creature, or planeswalker is countered this way, that permanent loses all abilities for as long as Tishana's Tidebinder remains on the battlefield. Which means it gives us a threat that's instant speed, also stops abilities from being triggered and things like that. Obstinate Baloth and Whitley Fleege kind of go into a similar category. And I realize Obstinate Baloth is green, but let me explain. Obstinate Baloth is a 4 mana 4/4. When it enters, you gain 4 life. If a spell or ability an opponent controls causes you to discard Obstinate Baloth, put it on the battlefield instead of putting it into your graveyard. And then Whitley Fleege is another 4 mana 4/4. Green creatures get +1/+1, white creatures get +1/+1, and it has that discard ability as well. We're siding this in against the bounce decks because Hopeless Nightmare tears our deck apart. And if we have Obstinate Baloth and Whitley Fleege, Obstinate Baloth is a little bit better than Whitley Fleege if we can have the Hopeless Nightmare thing happen, because gaining 4 life is just so powerful. And so we side these in against those decks, essentially because we can just win the game if we have that in hand and they Hopeless Nightmare us. Cool additional thing about Whitley Fleege too is it pumps up all of our white creatures and the tokens from the insects and stuff like that as well. Then we're playing 2 Dissection Tools, a 5 mana artifact. When Dissection Tools enters, manifest Dread, then attach Dissection Tools to that creature. Equip your creature gets +2/+2 as Death Touch and Lifelink, and we equipped it by sacrificing a creature. This can kind of slam the door on aggressive decks and stuff like that. Death Touch and Lifelink is just so powerful. This is blue-white control. As far as the sideboard goes, we have Devout Decree for red or black permanents. Rest in Peace for graveyard hate. Beza catches us up in a lot of different situations, whether it be super slow decks or like the fast decks or anything like that. Overlord of the Mistmoors is great against these mid-range decks, just really hard to answer threat. Negate for problematic non-creature spells. Tishana's Tidebinder for decks with a lot of enter the battlefield effects. Mostly is that. Whitley Fleege and Obstinate Baloth are counters to Hopeless Nightmare. And Dissection Tools is good against any deck that we need additional threats or a lifelink creature for aggro decks. That being said, the most popular deck in Standard is Gruul Aggro, and we're actually going to be sideboarding the same against Gruul Prowess and Mono Red. We're going to be bringing in these Devout Decree, Beza to help catch us up, and Dissection Tools just as a life linker. Going to be siding out of Negate because the creatures are the thing that we're really focused on and actually care about. And the Overlords because it's just a lot of mana. To just lose to a Monstrous Rage is just not fair. So this is how I'm going to sideboard against the red base aggro decks. The second most popular deck is the Esper Self Bounce. We're actually going to sideboard the same against Dimir Self Bounce as well, which is the 7th most popular deck. Against the 2 bounce decks, I'm a fan of Negate. Countering this sound ain't big enough is just a very big deal. Overlord is very good because it's really hard for them to answer it, as well as Obstinate Baloth and Wiltleaf Liege as counters to Hopeless Nightmare, and Tishana's Tidebinder because it's effectively a counter to like a lot of different things. That being said, we're going to cut down on these Jace Perfected Mind. We really don't need these Bezas. I'm not a fan of the Hornlock Whale because the Lagoon Breach isn't that good when there's a lot of enter the battlefield effects that we are really afraid of. I'm just going to shave on a stock up, and this is how I'm going to sideboard against the self-bounce decks. The third most popular deck in Standard is Domain. We're actually going to be sideboarding the same against the 4-color Zur deck, which is the 8th most popular deck as well. Against this deck, Negate is excellent, as well as Tishana's Tidebinder. And we'll be siding out of Temp Lockdown, and we want to bring in the Overlords just as many threats as possible. And we're just going to shave on a Beza. It doesn't do much against this deck. This is how I'm going to sideboard against the Domain decks. The 4th most popular deck is Dimir Midrange. We're actually going to be sideboarding the same against Dimir and Golgari. So against the mid-range decks, we're bringing in the Devout Decree. Overlord is absolutely insane against both of these decks. And we're just going to shave on these Bezas, and this is how I'm going to sideboard against the mid-range decks. So I talked about Golgari mid-range is 5th. Gruul Prowess, which is 6th, we've already talked about. Dimir Self Bounce is 7th, we've already talked about. 4-color Zur is 8th, which we've already talked about. Mono Red Prowess is 9th, which brings us all the way to Jeskai Oculus. Against the Oculus deck, we are bringing in the Rest in Peace Eyes, as well as Negate. I'm also a fan of Tishana's Tidebinder because it can neuter a lot out of the opponent's deck. And we're going to be shaving on cutting, these temporary lockdowns. Hornlock Whale doesn't do much. I don't want to return things to hand. And Beza just isn't really doing anything, which means we have a slot for one more thing, so we're just going to bring in the Overlord. So this is how I'm going to sideboard against the Jeskai Oculus deck.
So these are the non-flex slots in the blue-white control deck in Standard. If you play blue-white control, then you are pretty much signed up to play these 49 cards in the main deck and these 6 cards in the sideboard. So when you build this deck and you're tuning the deck, the question actually is, what 11 cards are you playing in the main deck in those flex slots? And what 9 cards are you playing in the sideboard? Well, this video is about that, so that's good. So if you want to look at the cards that you essentially have to play in this archetype, then feel free to pause the video. We're going to talk about the flex slots. So these are the flex slots in the blue-white control deck. You're going to be picking 11 cards out of these 28 cards in the main deck and 9 of these 20 cards in the sideboard to create your very own blue-white control deck. Let's talk about them. First off, 3 Steps Ahead is a 1-mana instant. However, it has spree, so you pay additional stuff depending on what you want the instant to do. You pay an additional 2 mana to counter target spell, an additional 3 to create a token that's a copy of target artifact or creature you control. And you pay an additional 2 to draw 2 cards, then discard a card. So at its worst, this card is cancel, which is totally fine. However, if you have a bunch of mana, you can pay 5 mana to counter a spell and also sculpt your hand. And then there's corner case things, especially since this deck plays Overlords, where creating a copy of a creature can kind of end the game. So playing 3 Steps Ahead is really cool, you know, in a deck like this. It's just competing with slots for a bunch of other powerful cards. You can play the 4th Get Lost. Get Lost is a 2-mana instant. Destroy target creature, enchantment, or planeswalker's controller. Its controller creates 2 map tokens. This is just unconditional removal. Also, really sweet instant speed removal against enchantments. We can play Change the Equation. Change the Equation is a 2-mana instant. Choose 1 counter target spell with mana value 2 or less, or counter target red or green spell with mana value 6 or less. This is just very good because most of Standard is pretty low to the ground, and so often this can just counter most things. It can be kind of limited against certain decks and certain cards, though. We can play up to 4 Deduce. It's a 2-mana instant draw card. Investigate, which means you create a clue token, which means you can pay 2 mana and draw a card off of it. Technically, this is 4 mana, 2 cards replaces 1. It's a good card, but with standard being pretty low to the ground right now, it's hard to be able to afford spending 4 mana on something that doesn't actually affect the board. However, if you do have that mana and you find yourself having that mana, then this is for sure like a killer card. You can play 2 Negate. Negate, 2 mana instant, counter target non-creature spell. It's excellent at fighting counter wars and countering relevant things. I mean, most of the cards that are good against control are non-creature spells, so we love that. Normalize, 2 mana instant, counter target spell unless controller pays 3. Spells countered this way, exile instead of putting it to its owner's graveyard. Obviously, like, it's an unconditional counter spell in the early game, and then it like loses stock for sure in the late game, because as they get more lands, it's easier to play around. Play the 4th Stock Up, which is a 3-mana sorcery. Look at the top 5 cards of your library, put 2 of them into your hand, and the rest of the bottom of your library in any order. Right? It's essentially dig through time. 5 cards is so many, and then being able to select 2 of them is just so good. I think the one issue with this card is 3 mana is quite a lot for something that doesn't affect the board. So it can be kind of tough finding what turn you're allowed to play this. But I feel like if you untap after you play this, you should start controlling the game. You can play Tishana's Tidebinder. It's a 3-mana 3/2 with flash. When Tishana's Tidebinder enters, counter up to 1 target activated or triggered ability. If an ability of an artifact, creature, or planeswalker is countered this way, that permanent loses all abilities for as long as Tishana's Tidebinder remains on the battlefield. Very good at countering abilities. I mean, it's also a threat, so it can kind of end the game reasonably quickly. 3 power is a lot. So you can stop what something does, something like Leyline Binding or whatever, while being able to apply pressure and block, which is really nice. You can play the 3rd Beza. Beza's a 4-mana 4/5 legendary creature. When Beza the Bounding Spirit enters, create a treasure token. If an opponent controls more lands than you gain 4 life. If an opponent has more life than you, create 2 1/1 bluefish creature tokens if an opponent controls more creatures than you, and draw a card if an opponent has more cards in hand than you. It's a great catch-up card. It's mostly just insane against the aggro decks, because gaining life and then providing 3 blockers in 1 card is super good, but it can be really good catching up against mid-range and other control decks as well. You can play 2 Day of Judgment. Day of Judgment 3 and 4. 4 mana destroy all creatures. Board wipes are good. Like if you find yourself facing down creatures on turn. I don't know what to say about Day of Judgment. You can play Jace the Perfected Mind, number 3 and 4 in the main deck. It's a 4-mana planeswalker with completed, so 1 of the blue you can pay a Phyrexian mana for, so pay 2 life for if you'd like. If you do that, it starts with 2 less loyalty. Full retail, it starts at 5 loyalty. And its +1 is, until your next turn, up to 1 target creature gets -3, -0. Its -2 is target player mills 3 cards. Then if a graveyard has 20 or more cards in it, you draw 3 cards. Otherwise, you draw a card. And it's -X, target player mills 3 times X cards. So this is one of our primary win conditions, right? It makes it so it's really hard to attack, especially combined with all of the other counterspells and removal in the deck. We get to get card advantage while we mill our opponent out, and then very often we can just pay full retail for this, have our opponent mill 15 and win the game. We play a Ride's End. Ride's End's 5-mana instant. Exile target creature or vehicle. It costs 3 less if it targets a tap permanent. Very good against creatures that are attacking you. Essentially 2 mana. Exile removal is insane right now because there's a lot of triggered abilities when things die. So we love it. We can play a second Sunfall, 5 mana. Exile all creatures. Incubate X, where X is the number of creatures exiled this way. This is obviously like a better board wipe than Day of Judgment, but it costs 1 mana, right? It provides a threat and it exiles. Like I said, exile removal is crazy good in standard at the moment. The issue is, again, it costs 1 more mana, and if you're under pressure, that extra turn could be a really big deal. We play 2 Overlord of the Flood Pits. Overlord of the Flood Pits is a 5-mana 5/3 with flying. Whenever Overlord of the Flood Pits enters or attacks, draw 2 cards and discard a card. So it's a threat that can sculpt your hand, and it's a must answer. And it has Impending 4 for 3 mana. You can get this effect on turn 3, which is, again, sculpting your hand in the early game really good, and it can kind of just win the game in the long run, which is awesome. You can play a Hornlock Whale. It is a 6/6 with flash, ward 2. Hornlock Whale enters tapped unless it's your turn. So it's just like an awesome threat. at instant speed, which we love. However, on its adventure side, it's a Lagoon Breach is a 2-mana instant. The owner of target attacking creature you don't control puts it on their choice of top or bottom of their library. Just very, very good removal against, when you're under threat, and then it can just end the game in the late game. We can play Overlord of the Mistmoors, number 3 and 4. It is a 7-mana 6/6. When Overlord of the Mistmoors enters or attacks, create 2/2/1 white insect creature tokens with flying, and it has Impending 4 for 4 mana. So great threat, decent blockers, and something we can get out on turn 4, and then also like without devoting extra mana to it, it be a threat in the late game. So you're going to be selecting 11 of these 28 cards in the main deck. And then if we look at the sideboard, you're going to be selecting 9 of these 20 cards. So let's talk about them. Authority of the Consuls is a 1-mana enchantment. Creatures your opponent control enter tapped, and whenever a creature an opponent control enters, you gain 1 life. This is just good against the red base aggro decks, and Convoke, I guess, if you have room to side it in. But mostly it's the red base aggro decks. You're gaining life. Haste isn't a thing anymore. We love it. Elspeth's Might is a 1-mana instant. It deals 3 damage to target attacking or blocking creature. Creature would die this turn. Exile it instead. Again, this is mostly for the red base aggro decks, or like aggro decks in general. Exile removal is excellent, and it kills most things that are attacking you. We can play 2 Devout Decree as a 2-mana sorcery. Exile target creature or planeswalker that's black or red. Scry 1. Really good against Kaido and, again, the red base aggro decks. One thing is icky about it is that it's sorcery speed. So, me. You can play up to 1 Kutziel's Flanker. It's a 3-mana 3/1 with Flash. When it enters, choose 1. Put a +1/+1 counter on Kutziel's Flanker for each creature that left the battlefield under your control this turn. You gain 2 life. Scry 2. Exile target player's graveyard. So you get to choose one of those things. Kutziel's Flanker, I always have mixed feelings about. It's kind of like the Jack of all trades, Master of none card, because frankly, it's not very good at anything that it does, but it's one card that you can play in the sideboard that you can sideboard against a lot of different things. Now, the first ability you're rarely going to use, like that'll be a corner case ability, but gaining 2 life and Scry 2 is like pretty good against like aggressive decks, and frankly, even control decks. Being able to sculpt your hand and also provide a threat at instant speed. And exiling target player's graveyard is graveyard hate, again, while being able to provide a threat. It's not super good at either of those things, but it's both of those things, which is really nice. You can play an Elishnorn Mother of Machines. It's a 5-mana 4/7 with Vigilance. If a permanent entering causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. Permanents entering don't cause abilities of permanents your opponent control to trigger. Mostly just insane against Domain. Just like things not triggering is ridiculous. It's just insane. Also, it makes our Overlords better, which is really silly. We can play Overlord of the Mistmoors 3 and 4 in the sideboard instead of the main deck. We've talked about why that's good already. Same thing with Negate. We could play a Negate in the sideboard, and Tishana's Tidebinder we could play in the sideboard. Play up to 2 Jace Perfected Mind 3 and 4 in the sideboard rather than the main deck if we would like. Obstinate Baloth and Whitley Liege are in the same category. So Obstinate Baloth is a 4-mana 4/4. When it enters, you gain 4 life. If a spell or ability an opponent controls causes you to discard Obstinate Baloth, put it onto the battlefield instead of putting it into your graveyard. Whitley Liege is a 4-mana 4/4 as well. Other green creatures you control get +1/+1. Other white creatures you control get +1/+1. And if a spell or ability an opponent controls causes you to discard this card, put it onto the battlefield instead of putting it into your graveyard. So they have that same line of text there. The reason you would play these cards is Hopeless Nightmare. The big difference between the two is obviously you can't cast Obstinate Baloth at all in a normal game. So really you're just hoping they Hopeless Nightmare you. The thing is they have to keep Hopeless Nightmare in because that's how they beat the control deck. If they aren't tearing apart your hand, they don't apply enough pressure to be able to beat the bounce decks to be able to beat you that quickly. So it's likely you'll get to put Obstinate Baloth on the battlefield if you have it in your opening hand. Whitley Liege can pump up the Overlord and Beza and all that stuff, which is really cool. And you can do a similar thing, and you can actually cast it, which is all very, 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 very nice. The issue is 4 life is probably better than that additional pressure, so make that decision wisely. And then we can play Dissection Tools up to 2. It's a 5-mana artifact. When Dissection Tools enters, Manifest Dread, then attach Dissection Tools to that creature. Equipped creature gets +2/+2, has Death Touch and Lifelink. And we can equip by sacrificing a creature. putting this on an Overlord or a Beza or whatever can just end the game, or it just being a blocker can, again, just end the game. The beauty of it is it doesn't require mana to equip, so you can, like, turn 4 Beza, turn 5 Dissection Tools, sack the creature that manifested or a Beza fish, put it on Beza, gain 6 life, and it's kind of just over against aggressive decks, which is really, really cool. So you're going to be selecting 9 of these 20 cards to add to your sideboard. You're going to be selecting 11 of these 28 cards to add to your main deck. And then you have your very own but stock version of Blue-White Control in Standard.
And frankly, this Blue-White Control deck is pretty straightforward as far as a Blue-White Control deck goes. One, it's important to understand how Fountain Port exactly works, though. So Fountain Port is a colorless land. We can tap it to add a colorless mana. We can pay 2 mana and tap it to sacrifice a token and draw a card. We can pay 3 mana and tap it to pay 1 life, create a 1/1 blue fish creature token. And we can pay 4 mana and tap it to create a treasure token. So really, this is a mana dump for us. And it's really cute being able to sacrifice like Beza tokens and stuff like that, or like map tokens from Lester's Anchorage to draw cards, and that's super, super good. However, the way we're going to be using this most of the time is comboing it with a self. If we have an untapped Fountain Point and 3 more mana at the end of our opponent's turn, you know, if we didn't counterspell something or it's deep in the late game or whatever, we can just make a fish. We can then apply pressure with that fish, and then when we want to, sacrifice it and draw a card. And so it allows us to benefit from having so many lands and have the games go super, super long, because we can just bury our opponent in pressure and card draw. Second off, the biggest reason we're playing Jace is for card advantage, but also it's a win condition. We don't need to be using the Overlord and Beza and Hornlock Whale and stuff like that. Jace is a 4-mana Planeswalker that is completed. One of the blue is Phyrexian mana, so we can pay 2 life rather than blue if we want to. If we do that, it enters with 2 less loyalty. Its +1 is until your next turn, up to 1 target creature gets -3, -0. That most of the time doesn't really do anything. Is -2 is target player mills 3 cards. Then if a graveyard has 20 or more cards in it, draw 3 cards. Otherwise, you draw a card. It's -X as target player mills 3 times X cards. So the first Jace that we play on a clear board, normally we're just gonna be like, hey, my opponent mill 3 cards, I'm gonna draw a card, and it's that card advantage. You kind of have to answer it, because once every few turns, I'm going to draw cards off of it. If I activate it too many times and the game goes too long, I get draw 3 cards out of it, and then the game's just over. But after a few Jace activations, the game goes a little long, maybe our opponent draws some cards, whatever. We eventually get to a point where you can just pay 4 mana for Jace, say -5, mill 15, and then just like you're so far ahead, and that's like the clock we put on our opponent, rather than having to put a clock on the board, like with creatures. And then the last kind of thing is we're playing Obstinate Baloth and Wiltly Fleege for the for discard effects like Hopeless Nightmare. Wiltly Fleege has other modes. One, we can actually cast it as opposed to Obstinate Baloth, but also it pumps up Beza, it pumps up Overlord and the insects it creates. And so it can very much be lethal, you know, when we play it, pump everything up, make blockers much, 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 much bigger. And if we have multiple Wiltly Fleeges on the battlefield, they pump each other up twice, so they're both 6/6s, so it's just disgusting. If you like this video, please be sure to like and subscribe. Check me out on social medias. Links are above me and in the description. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.